Although I fully understood the challenges of pregnancy, I couldn't bear the thought of feeling like a servant in my own home, especially after the recent heartbreak of losing my child. So, I confronted my husband, but his response left me stunned. He said, "Sweetheart, she's dealing with a lot right now. We should be helping her. Besides, it might actually make you feel better to care for someone who's pregnant." His words ignited a deep anger in me. While I didn't want to diminish her struggles, my husband and I were also battling our own pain. Nevertheless, we pushed forward. I tried my best to juggle work and household responsibilities. With my husband working from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., his absence meant I was left to handle everything alone. My full-time remote job only added to the pressure. Whenever I sought help from my sister-in-law, she always had an excuse ready. The breaking point came when I treated myself to some comfort food after my miscarriage, something I had finally found a bit of joy in. I even wrote my name on it and explicitly asked her not to touch it. But when I went to the fridge to get it, I discovered she had eaten it. I told my husband, and of course he just threw it back in my face, saying that she was pregnant. I needed to be less selfish, and that life is all about sacrifices. I was livid. I told him that it felt like I was living with terrible roommates rather than a supportive husband and sister-in-law. He didn't handle it well. Not long after, my sister-in-law decided to throw an impromptu baby shower at my home without even informing me. I wasn't sure if I could even be present when it happened. It hurt deeply that she wouldn't communicate with me, especially considering everything that had transpired, and that she would invite strangers into someone else's home without asking first. My husband insisted that I attend, warning that it could permanently damage my relationship with her if I didn't, so I reluctantly agreed to go. About midway through the event, my husband and sister-in-law announced they wanted to show everyone the nursery. I was baffled. Nursery? Was she staying that long? Which room had been turned into a nursery? They directed everyone upstairs. That's when it hit me. They were talking about the nursery I had prepared for my baby, the one I had just lost. A flood of emotions overwhelmed me as I watched them all gather in the space meant for my child, praising her for how well she had set it up. The setup I had carefully crafted for a baby my body couldn't bring into this world. I completely broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, and then that sadness twisted into raw anger. I began shouting at my sister-in-law, accusing her of being the most heartless person for putting me through months of torment, treating me like nothing more than a maid or a tool for her convenience. Through my choked tears, I turned to my husband, who stood there in shock, his mouth agape. I looked around and saw his entire family staring at me, wide-eyed. I lost it again, screaming. I fixed my gaze on my sister-in-law and demanded to know how she could dare to use my nursery, the one meant for my child. How could she think she had any right? Her response made me collapse to the floor, sobbing. "It's not my fault you couldn't have a baby. Why let the room go to waste? You're just being selfish." My husband tried to help me up, but I screamed once more, struggling to stand on my now trembling knees. I demanded that he choose between me and her. He just stood there, utterly bewildered, unable to respond. I shouted once more, demanding, "It's either her or me." He stood there at a loss for words, his silence more damning than anything he could have said. The sting of betrayal pierced through me as I stared at him, my heart aching. Unable to bear it, I shoved my way through the gathering of family members and rushed out the door. Later, I found myself sitting on my bed, wiping away the tears that refused to stop falling. I made a promise to myself. I would not tolerate this level of disrespect. With resolve, I headed downstairs, closing the nursery door behind me. What greeted me was a scene that only added salt to the wound. Everyone was gathered around, comforting my sister-in-law. With a calm but firm voice, I asked everyone except my sister-in-law and husband to kindly leave my house. Their judgmental stares and whispered criticisms didn't faze me. When the door finally closed behind the last of them, it was just the three of us: my husband, his sister, and me. They sat silently on the couch, a heavy, uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. I joined them, the quiet stretching on endlessly, none of us daring to break it. But I knew the conversation had to start somewhere. I looked my husband in the eye and asked, "Have you made your decision?" He just stared at me, saying nothing. I repeated the question, this time with more force. He mumbled something under his breath, some barely audible insult involving the word bitch. That was it. I stood up and told them both to leave. Suddenly, they wanted to talk, insisting that it was all a misunderstanding, that they were sorry. Whatever. I wasn't having it. I grabbed a backpack from the closet and handed it to them, telling them to pack their things. My sister-in-law, indignant, claimed I had no right to kick her out and called me a horrible person. I laughed in her face, reminding her that this was my house, and I could do as I pleased. My husband stepped beside me, trying to placate her by saying it would only be for a short time. I turned to him, my voice cold, and said, "Oh, you two, get out." He was furious, telling me that this wasn't how marriage was supposed to work. I told him firmly that marriage isn't supposed to be like this. It's a partnership where both people lift each other up, not a place where one person treats the other like garbage. After hurling a barrage of insults at me, they finally left. But that wasn't the end of it. This morning, just as I was preparing for a Zoom meeting with a few colleagues, my husband showed up unexpectedly. I let him in, telling him to grab whatever he needed, and then leave since I had to work. He started apologizing, saying he wanted to fix things. I told him I needed some space. Then he hit me with something I never saw coming. He said, "It's not my fault you lost our children. Maybe this would never have happened if things were different." My sister was right. "You really are selfish," he added. Never once had I ever made him feel like he couldn't share his grief with me. I never made him feel less because of his pain. In a moment of pure shock and anger, I slapped him. I've never believed in violence, and I'm deeply ashamed that I did that, but at that moment I just couldn't handle it. He stepped back. Then in a fit of rage, he knocked all of my makeup off the counter. He started smashing everything in the bathroom, even going as far as punching a hole in the wall. It was as if all the grief he had bottled up over the loss of our children erupted in that moment. But he crossed a line when he tried to grab me and started yelling inches from my face. I shoved him away and told him to get the hell out. He stormed out of the bathroom, smashing a few more things on his way out. As soon as he was gone, a wave of panic washed over me, staring at the chaos he'd left behind and realizing just how deeply he'd buried his pain. I immediately called my mom and poured out everything that had happened. She said she was coming over right away. The moment she walked through the door, I broke down, and she wrapped me in her arms. Then she stood up and started taking pictures of all the things he'd destroyed. When I asked what she was doing, she looked at me and said, "We're taking this jerk to court." I didn't even protest. I was too shattered by everything my husband had put me through. My mom packed up my computer while I grabbed a few clothes. We drove to a hotel together, and she insisted on staying with me while I finished up some work. She also called a locksmith and my lawyer. Divorce is definitely on the horizon,